On December 7, 1941, the United States awoke to the sound of sirens, radio bulletins, and disbelief. Japanese aircraft swept over Pearl Harbor, and within hours the country would abandon any remaining illusion of distance from the global war. The date would become sacred in American memory, described as the day everything changed, the day the nation entered World War II. But that framing, while powerful, is incomplete. By the time the first bombs fell in Hawaii, American industry had already been fueling Britain's resistance for months. American warships were already escorting convoys across the Atlantic, and American sailors had already died in clashes with German submarines. Long before Congress declared war, the United States had been fighting one in all but name. The road to open conflict did not begin in a single morning of fire and smoke. It began quietly, gradually, in policy decisions, naval patrol routes, and calculated risks that blurred the line between neutrality and participation. To understand how the United States entered the Second World War, it is necessary to look beyond Pearl Harbor and into the shadow war that unfolded in the Atlantic during 1940 and 1941, when the nation was officially at peace, but increasingly entangled in a global struggle it claimed to avoid. In the 1930s, the American public had little appetite for another European conflict. The trauma of World War I still lingered deeply in the national consciousness. Many believed the United States had been manipulated into that earlier war by economic interests and foreign entanglements. The Great Depression further reinforced a desire to focus inward, to rebuild the economy and avoid costly foreign adventures. Congress responded to these sentiments with a series of neutrality acts designed to prevent the circumstances that had led to intervention in 1917. These laws restricted arms sales, loans, and travel to belligerent nations. The message was clear: America would not be dragged into another European catastrophe. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939 and war erupted across Europe, the United States declared neutrality. Official statements emphasized impartiality. The country would trade, but cautiously. It would observe, but not intervene. Yet neutrality in practice is rarely absolute. Even in 1939, adjustments were made. The cash and carry provision allowed belligerent nations to purchase American goods as long as they paid cash and transported the materials themselves. This policy favored Britain and France, whose navies controlled the seas, while limiting Germany's ability to benefit. It was a legal distinction that signaled a strategic leaning. As 1940 unfolded, events in Europe intensified pressure on American policymakers. Germany's blitzkrieg overwhelmed Denmark and Norway, then the Netherlands and Belgium, and finally France. In June 1940, France collapsed with shocking speed. Britain stood alone against the expanding power of Nazi Germany. The prospect of a German-dominated Europe forced American leaders to reconsider their assumptions. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that if Britain fell, the Atlantic Ocean would no longer serve as a comfortable buffer. A hostile power controlling European ports and fleets could project influence across the ocean. American security, in Roosevelt's view, was linked to Britain's survival. Yet he faced a divided nation. Isolationist sentiment remained strong. The America First Committee argued that involvement in the European war would bring unnecessary destruction. Influential voices insisted that oceans were sufficient defense and that aiding Britain would inevitably draw the United States into direct conflict. Roosevelt could not openly call for war, but he could move incrementally. In 1940, he authorized the transfer of 50 aging American destroyers to Britain in exchange for base rights in the Western Hemisphere. This destroyers for bases agreement was framed as a defensive arrangement, strengthening hemispheric security. In reality, it marked a significant step away from strict neutrality. American ships were being handed to a nation actively fighting Germany. The progression continued in March 1941 with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. This legislation allowed the United States to supply arms, equipment, food, and other materials to countries whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Roosevelt described the policy with a domestic analogy. If a neighbor's house was on fire, you would lend him a hose rather than demand payment up front. The metaphor suggested temporary assistance, not permanent commitment. But Lend-Lease transformed the United States into the primary supplier of Britain's war effort. Factories across America accelerated production of aircraft, tanks, rifles, ammunition, and ships. Cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic loaded with the tools of modern warfare, though American soldiers were not yet fighting on European soil. American industry had become indispensable to Britain's survival. Supplying a belligerent nation on that scale was not a neutral act in strategic terms. It was participation through production. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic intensified. German U-boats sought to sever Britain's lifeline by sinking merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons. Without secure supply routes, Britain could be starved into submission. As American shipments increased under Lend-Lease, the security of Atlantic shipping lanes became a matter of American interest. Initially, the United States extended its naval patrols under the banner of hemispheric defense. American ships monitored waters in the western Atlantic, reporting submarine sightings to the British. This intelligence sharing was crucial. It allowed British escorts to react more effectively to U-boat threats. In April 1941, the United States expanded its security zone deep into the Atlantic, effectively claiming responsibility for monitoring vast stretches of ocean that were operational theaters of war. American warships began escorting convoys as far as Iceland after U.S. forces occupied the island in July 1941 to prevent German control. Though technically escorting only part of the journey, American destroyers were now operating in areas where contact with German submarines was likely. The boundary between defense and combat grew thinner by the week. Tensions escalated in September 1941 when the destroyer USS Greer encountered a German U-boat. The details of who fired first remain debated, but the exchange involved depth charges and torpedoes. News of the incident reached the American public, raising fears that the nation was sliding toward open conflict. Roosevelt responded with a decisive shift. He announced a shoot-on-sight policy. Any Axis warship threatening American defense zones could be attacked without warning. This order effectively authorized naval warfare without a formal declaration. The United States was no longer merely observing or reporting submarine movements. It was prepared to engage them directly. The shift was profound. It signaled that neutrality had become conditional and heavily armed. The consequences soon turned deadly. On October 17, 1941, the destroyer USS Kearney was torpedoed by a German submarine while escorting a convoy near Iceland. 11 American sailors were killed. The attack was not a hypothetical threat. It was bloodshed. Roosevelt addressed the nation, describing the incident as unprovoked aggression. Yet critics argued that American escorts and shoot-on-sight orders had placed U.S. ships in combat situations. 2 weeks later, on October 31st, the destroyer USS Reuben James was sunk by another U-boat. More than 100 American sailors lost their lives. These were casualties of war in everything but official terminology. Funerals were held. Families mourned. Newspapers reported the losses. The United States had not declared war on Germany, but American servicemen were dying at German hands, and German submariners were being hunted by American vessels. The undeclared naval war in the Atlantic was now undeniable. Still, Roosevelt did not seek a declaration of war from Congress. Public opinion, though shifting, was not yet unified in favor of full-scale involvement against Germany. The President continued to frame actions as defensive measures necessary to protect American security and supply routes. Each escalation was justified as a response rather than an initiation. Convoy escorts were defensive. Patrol expansions were protective. Shoot-on-sight was deterrence. Yet in strategic reality, the United States had entered the conflict incrementally. By late 1941, American warships were deeply integrated into Allied naval operations in the Atlantic. Industrial mobilization accelerated further. Shipyards operated around the clock. Aircraft factories expanded. Training programs enlarged the armed forces dramatically. The Selective Service Act, passed in 1940, had already initiated the first peacetime draft in American history, signaling preparation for potential war. While the public debated intervention, the machinery of mobilization advanced steadily. At the same time, tensions with Japan intensified in the Pacific. Economic sanctions, including oil embargoes, aimed to curb Japanese expansion in Asia. Diplomatic negotiations continued, but grew increasingly strained. The global conflict was converging toward the United States from both oceans. Yet even as attention turned toward the Pacific crisis, the Atlantic conflict remained active and dangerous. American destroyers continued escort missions. Submarine contacts continued. The undeclared naval war persisted in the cold waters between North America and Europe. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the shock unified the nation instantly. Isolationist arguments collapsed in the face of direct attack. Congress declared war on Japan on December 8th. 4 days later, Germany declared war on the United States, formalizing what had already been happening in the Atlantic for months. The transformation was immediate. The secret war became official. Naval engagements that had been politically sensitive were now openly acknowledged as part of a global conflict. Yet the idea that December 7th marked the true beginning of American participation obscures the complexity of the preceding year. The United States had been arming Britain, escorting convoys, sharing intelligence, expanding patrol zones, and engaging submarines well before Pearl Harbor. Sailors had died. Shots had been exchanged. Industrial mobilization had accelerated to unprecedented levels. The process was gradual, deliberate, and strategic. Roosevelt navigated domestic politics carefully, moving step by step rather than with a single, dramatic declaration. This incremental path allowed public opinion to evolve alongside policy. By the time formal war came, the nation was materially and psychologically more prepared than it would have been in 1939 or 1940. Pearl Harbor did not initiate American involvement in World War II. It eliminated the ambiguity surrounding it. The shadow war in the Atlantic reveals how nations often enter conflicts not through one decisive moment, but through a series of calculated decisions that accumulate over time. Neutrality can erode slowly, reshaped by perceived threats, strategic interests, and geopolitical realities. In 1941, the United States stood at the intersection of ideology and pragmatism, balancing popular reluctance against strategic necessity. The undeclared naval war was the bridge between isolation and full engagement. It was fought in gray waters, under gray skies, without the clarity of formal declarations, yet with real weapons and real casualties. Understanding this hidden chapter reshapes the narrative of American entry into World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the spark that ignited public unity, but the tinder had been laid long before. Factories were humming, convoys were sailing, destroyers were patrolling, and submarines were stalking. By December 1941, the United States was already deeply entwined in the struggle for control of the Atlantic. The war did not begin in a single morning of explosions. It emerged from months of quiet escalation, political maneuvering, and naval confrontation. In the shadows of official neutrality, the United States had already crossed the threshold into global war. One convoy, one patrol, and one torpedo at a time. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the strategies that shaped the modern world. See you soon.